The war had ended, at least on paper, but the walls of the old Alsatian town still bore its wounds with a kind of subdued dignity, cracks in stone facades once kissed by sunlight, bullet-scarred wooden shutters that creaked in the wind, and streets that echoed more with silence than song, as if the air itself had yet to learn how to breathe freely again. Madeleine Rousseau, now 32, had lived through that silence with the quiet patience of someone who had learned not to expect miracles, only manageable days. Since her father's passing 4 years earlier, a death slow and breathless, worsened by the hardships of occupation and the winter that refused to end, she had taken over his café on Rue des Tanneurs, serving tarte aux pommes and strong black coffee to a generation still learning how to live again without the constant threat of loss. Each morning, before the sun broke over the red-tiled roofs of Colmar, she would light the stove, tie her apron, and reach instinctively into its pocket to touch a small, weathered photo, no larger than the palm of her hand, that had traveled with her through every season since the summer of 1944. The image, worn and curled at the edges, showed a young man with sharp cheekbones, wind-tossed hair, and the kind of smile that spoke not only of affection, but of defiance, the smile of someone who had dared to love in a world tearing itself apart. His name was Jean Valjean, and once he had been her world. They had met in secret, beneath trees that whispered the names of the fallen, their love carved between resistance missions and stolen hours, always under the shadow of capture. Jean, a member of the French resistance operating in the Vosges, had vanished during a night raid near Strasbourg in March of 1944, taken, she later learned, by German forces in retaliation for an ambushed convoy. Days after his disappearance, a letter arrived at the café, addressed in a hurried hand she knew better than her own. The ink had faded, but the words had never left her. "If I don't return, live for both of us." And so she tried. Through the liberation, through the flags and funerals, through the years that offered no further letters, no confirmation, no grave, she waited for a time, a year, then 2, before the waiting gave way to endurance, and endurance to resignation. No name on a list, no whisper from returning comrades, only the void where his voice had once lived, until that morning. It was October, and the light outside was thin and grey, the kind of sky that felt like a held breath. Madeleine, her hands warm with flour and routine, was wiping the last of the tables when the door opened, the small brass bell above it chiming with a sound far too gentle for what was about to unfold. He stepped inside, a man older than memory had allowed, with a limp that whispered of pain buried deep in the bone, a coat 2 sizes too large, and eyes that carried more than years. She turned to greet the customer, polite and practiced, but the cloth slipped from her fingers before the words could form. Time stilled. It was Jean. Not the boy from the photograph, not the voice from the letter, but the man that time, pain, and war had failed to destroy. And though the café hummed behind her, spoons on saucers, murmurs of morning news, steam curling from cups, Madeleine saw only him, as he once was and as he now stood. She did not speak. She could not. Because somehow, against every quiet truth she had come to accept, the war had not taken him after all. And just outside, as if to mark the moment with something sacred, it began to rain. If this story is already touching your heart the way it touched mine as I wrote it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Madeleine did not move at first. Her eyes, still locked on the man at the door, blinked only when the light shifted, as if needing proof that he was truly standing there, flesh and breath, and not some cruel mirage sent by years of longing. Around her, the café resumed its rhythm with unknowing indifference. A spoon stirred sugar into a glass. Someone lit a cigarette. The old clock above the counter ticked forward by one small beat. He hesitated near the threshold, scanning the room with the cautious gaze of a man who no longer assumed safety in any space. His left leg dragged slightly, a quiet shuffle born not just of injury, but of habit, the kind of limp that comes from months, perhaps years, of forgetting how to walk freely. His coat hung loosely on his shoulders, more draped than worn, and the wool beret sat crooked atop his graying hair, soaked slightly from the rain. But despite the years that had carved lines into his face and the weight that war had etched into his posture, Madeleine knew, her soul knew, it was Jean. Not the boy she had kissed beneath moonlit trees in 1943, nor the fierce idealist who had sworn to return, but the man he had become after disappearing into the machinery of war, a man pulled from the edges of death and delivered back into the ordinary world without warning or permission. He approached the counter slowly, eyes never quite landing on hers, as though unsure if she would welcome him or collapse beneath the sight of him. And perhaps, in a way, she was doing both. She did not greet him with his name. Not yet. There were too many questions tangled in her chest, too many memories still vibrating beneath her skin. Instead, she gestured gently toward a table near the window, the one where sunlight used to fall in long golden bands when the world still made sense, and where he had once traced invisible words on the wood with his fingers while waiting for her to close shop. He nodded and limped toward the seat, lowering himself with a quiet breath, the sound of someone learning to sit in peace again. The other patrons glanced at him with idle curiosity, but it was clear none of them recognized the man for who he truly was. Only Madeleine saw what had survived the fire, as she brought him a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just as he used to take it. Snippets of whispered conversation began to surface from a nearby table. Talk of a man returned from the East, a prisoner of war held by the Soviets, one of the forgotten few lost in the cold aftermath of Berlin's fall. 6 years in captivity, someone murmured. Released just last month. No family, no home, only a name. Madeleine listened, her hand trembling slightly as she placed the cup in front of him. He looked up at her then, really looked. And in his eyes, beneath the ash and the ache, she saw the ghost of the boy he had been. The silence between them stretched, not heavy with discomfort, but weighted with everything they had not yet said. Colmar, with its pastel houses and flower-laced balconies, had rebuilt itself while they were apart. But to him, every stone must have looked different now, a city made strange by absence, a map redrawn by grief. And yet, in that quiet space between the rain and the brewing steam, Jean had returned to the only place that had once held his heart. Madeleine wanted to speak, to ask how he had survived, where he had gone, why he hadn't written, but none of those questions made it past her lips. Instead, she simply sat across from him, the air between them thick with something too sacred to name. And outside, the rain softened, as if giving them permission to begin again. The cup of coffee between them had long since cooled, but neither of them noticed. For a long while they sat in that fragile stillness, like two survivors surveying the ruins of something sacred. Outside, the drizzle painted the windows in soft, trembling lines, and inside, the room seemed to contract around them, voices fading, chairs scraping gently, the world shrinking to the space they occupied and the years that stood between them. Then Jean spoke. His voice was softer than she remembered, not broken exactly, but worn down like riverstone, smoothed by time and repetition. He began slowly, like someone remembering how to be heard. He didn't start with apologies or declarations, only facts, scattered like breadcrumbs through a dark forest. He told her of Strasbourg, the night of the ambush, how he had been separated from his unit during a retreat through the outskirts of Neudorf. The last thing he remembered clearly was the sound of boots in wet grass and the sharp crack of rifle fire. After that, only darkness and the cold floor of a transport truck. He had spent the final months of the war moving between makeshift prisons and interrogation rooms, eventually handed over to Soviet forces when Alsace fell into Allied hands. From there, he was sent to a camp in Belarus, a place with no name, only numbers, where he lived for 6 years among men who no longer counted days. Madeleine listened, eyes fixed on his face. Her fingers curled lightly around the edge of the table, as if bracing for waves. He described long winters with no fire, the ache of hunger that gnawed through bone, the sound of men calling out in dreams for wives they would never see again. He spoke of frostbite, of digging graves with bare hands, of a language he never learned but came to understand, the universal dialect of survival. And then he told her something else. There had been another letter. He had written it during his first year in captivity, a desperate attempt scratched onto a scrap of paper, smuggled through a Polish guard who had once fought for the French in North Africa. In it, he had explained everything: his capture, his belief that she might think him dead, and his promise, again, that he would return. But the letter never arrived. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps it was burned. Perhaps the guard had simply vanished, like so many others, swallowed by the machinery of post-war chaos. Hearing this, Madeleine felt something deep inside her shift. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something softer, something less heavy. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the photograph, laying it gently on the table between them. Then, with quiet reverence, she placed the original letter beside it. Jean's hand trembled as he picked it up. He read the words he had once written, words she had memorized, whispered, cried over, and his eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "I thought about this letter every day," he murmured, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. "It kept me alive. Not just the idea that you had received it, but that somewhere, even if you believed me gone, someone still remembered me before I became a number." Madeleine closed her eyes. In that moment, the war returned in flashes. Not the battles, but the waiting. The nights spent curled on the cafe floor, the weeks when rations ran thin, the letters she never received, the birthdays passed in silence. And always, always, the sound of his voice echoing in her mind, "Live for both of us." She opened her eyes again, and this time, they did not look away from each other. And then, as if some unseen reel began to turn in the back of her mind, the cafe faded into memory. She was 19 again, barefoot in the orchard behind her father's house, watching Jean build a radio transmitter from broken parts. She was 20, hiding with him beneath the beams of a barn, sharing stolen peaches and stories of cities they might never see. She was 21, kissing him for the last time under a sky heavy with smoke, tasting goodbye on his lips before he disappeared into the trees. The memories came like waves, relentless, beautiful, aching. John leaned forward, his hand hovering over the photograph. "I came back," he said softly, "but not the same. I don't know how to begin again." Madeleine didn't answer right away. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was steady but low. "Then don't begin," she said. "Just continue from here." And though nothing had been decided and nothing had been promised, something fragile and unspoken passed between them. Not hope, not yet, but something like a beginning. The cafe, though filled with the gentle noise of mid-morning regulars, the scraping of chairs, the faint clink of cutlery, the distant murmur of a transistor radio, seemed to Madeleine like a vessel suspended in another dimension, where the lives of others carried on unknowing, untouched by the reunion unfolding at table 4. Jean sat with his hands clasped around the empty coffee cup, his eyes watching the rain trace slow rivers down the glass, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. Perhaps back in the forest where they had once hidden supplies, or maybe in the frostbitten barracks where names had become numbers and days bled into each other without meaning. Madeleine, across from him, was not thinking of the war anymore. She was thinking of 1948. She had not meant to speak, but the words came, quietly at first, and then with a strange, inevitable calm, like someone confessing to a diary rather than a man who had come back from the dead. "I married," she said, her voice steady, eyes not quite meeting his. Jean did not flinch, but something shifted in the way he held his breath. She explained how she had waited through the first 2 years after liberation, how the silence of his absence had grown louder than any voice, how the town, and more urgently, her mother, had begun to whisper behind closed doors. The war was over, they had said. The missing would not return. Life must go on. She had resisted, through kind suitors and family pressure, until she no longer had the strength to keep living in pause. In 1948, she married Luc Marchand, a local widower whose gentle nature had offered comfort without demand. It was a quiet union, one that promised stability rather than passion, companionship rather than poetry. And just as she had begun to learn how to share her days again, Luc died in a logging accident less than a year into their marriage, a tragedy wrapped in silence, mourned privately, spoken of rarely. Jean did not speak for a long time after that. When he finally did, it was with a weight Madeleine had not expected. "I had a son," he said. She blinked. It took her a moment to understand. "In the camp," he continued, voice low, "there was a woman, Polish. Her name was Anya. We were prisoners, yes, but for a while in that place, we became human together. She was warmth, a shared crust of bread, laughter when we could barely remember how to smile." He paused, staring at the steam rising from a fresh cup she had placed before him, untouched. She became pregnant. "We didn't know until it was almost too late. I was transferred. She was left behind. I never saw her again." "And the child?" Madeleine asked, though the question caught in her throat. "She died during the birth, from what I was told," Jean said, his voice hollow. "The boy survived, taken to an orphanage. I've never found him." Silence returned, thick and unforgiving. And yet, beneath that silence, something had changed between them, not broken, but altered, like glass fogged by breath, waiting to be cleared. They were no longer the dreamers of 1944, bound only by the promise of youth and the fire of resistance. They were people weathered by time, shaped by choices neither had truly wanted to make. Grief had etched itself into both of their lives in different languages, but the emotion, the loneliness, the guilt, the longing, was the same. Madeleine looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man she had once loved, nor the soldier returned from the void, but a human being carved by absence, as she had been. "You're not the only one who lost a life," she said softly. Jean nodded, and for a moment they sat in that space where honesty finally took its seat at the table, not to accuse, not to regret, but simply to exist. They did not touch. They did not cry. They sat as two people trying to understand what could be salvaged when all that was pure had already burned. And then, without words, Madeleine rose. She walked behind the counter, poured 2 cups of tea, not coffee, not now, and returned. In silence, they drank together, as if it were a ritual not of reconciliation, but of recognition, of what they had been, of what they had lost, and of what perhaps still remained. The café emptied slowly as the grey October day folded into early dusk. Chairs were stacked, counters wiped, the last of the tarts aux pommes sold to a widow with a cane who always left a few coins extra, as if tipping the past. Madeleine moved with practiced ease, her hands guiding her through motions older than memory. But inside, her thoughts wandered, pacing through shadows, tracing the sound of a voice she thought she'd never hear again. Jean remained seated, as if unsure what to do once the world around them had quieted. His presence was less a disruption now, and more a question, not loud, but persistent, like the distant echo of something unfinished. She did not ask him to leave. Instead, when the lights had been dimmed and the sign turned to fermé, Madeleine gestured toward the back, her fingers soft and hesitant. Wordlessly, Jean followed her into the small kitchen behind the café, a space untouched by time, with its blue-tiled walls, hanging copper pans, and the faint scent of thyme and old flour. There, at the narrow wooden table, where her father once read the paper, and where she herself had wept more than once into her tea, they sat across from each other again. The overhead lamp hummed quietly, casting a warm pool of light between them, as if trying to protect this fragile moment from the weight of everything outside. Madeleine reached into her apron, and for the first time in 6 years, she unfolded the letter. Its paper, thin and yellowed, crackled like autumn leaves. She placed it before him, along with the photograph, the same one she had shown earlier, but now it felt different, like a relic offered not from pain, but from peace. Jean picked up the letter with trembling fingers, reading it again as if for the first time. "You kept it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "I read it every morning." "Not because I thought you'd come back," she said, "but because I needed to remember how it felt, to believe in something." He looked at her, his eyes shining in the dim light, and for the first time that day he wept. Not loudly, not brokenly, but with the quiet sorrow of a man who had carried too much for too long. The tears slid down his cheeks slowly, like rain down stone. "Did you think of me?" she asked, not as an accusation, but as a wound reopening just enough to breathe. He met her gaze. "Every time I closed my eyes, especially when I wanted not to open them again." She took a sip of her tea. "Then why did you come now?" Jean hesitated. His fingers grazed the edge of the letter, then softly, "Because I couldn't forget you. Not even when I tried." No promises followed, no sudden declarations. They were not young anymore, they had no illusions left. But in the way they sat, hands resting near, not touching, eyes steady, not searching, there was something more honest than any vow. Madeleine reached across the table, brushing her fingers lightly against his. Not a lover's touch, a survivor's. "I never moved that table," she said, nodding toward the windowed corner of the cafe. "I kept it exactly as you left it, just in case." He smiled, a tired, grateful curve of his lips that made him look, for a moment, like the man in the photograph. "And now?" he asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. In the stillness of that kitchen, surrounded by chipped tile and the smell of tea leaves, they existed not in past or future, but in the only place love truly survives, the present, fragile and real. Outside, the rain had stopped. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was full. Jean left just after sunrise. The light over Colmar was soft, almost golden, stretching long across the narrow streets and casting delicate shadows on the rain-washed stones. Madeleine stood at the threshold of the cafe, arms crossed against the morning chill, watching as he disappeared slowly down Rue des Tanneurs, his silhouette limping gently, coat gathered close, head slightly bowed, not in defeat, but in thought. He hadn't said when he'd return, and she hadn't asked. There had been no need. Some promises are better left unwritten, living instead in the space between heartbeats, not rushed, not pressed, just quietly waiting for their time. Madeleine reopened the cafe as she had every morning for the past 4 years, unlocking the shutters, checking the ovens, lighting the lamps. The regulars came and went as always. The factory worker with his burnt toast, the widow with the quiet smile, the young boy who saved his coins for pain au chocolat. But something had changed, not visibly, not outwardly, but in the way she moved, slower, more deliberate, in the way she listened when people spoke, in the way she looked toward the door, not with dread or hope, but with acceptance, as if finally at peace with whatever might walk through it. That afternoon, after the rush had faded and the cafe was quiet once more, Madeleine took down the framed photograph of her father, the one that had hung on the wall since the liberation, and gently shifted it to the left. In the space it had occupied for years, she placed the letter, Jean's letter. She had framed it in simple oak, beneath glass slightly fogged with age, the ink faint but still legible. Below it, she pinned the photograph, the same worn image she had carried in her apron day after day, through grief and habit and longing. She did not hang them as decoration. not as relics of a past to be worshipped, but as truth, truth that love endures, even when torn by silence, truth that waiting is not always in vain, truth that we do not always need to return to who we were, only to remember why we became who we are. Over the weeks that followed, the letter became part of the cafe. Customers noticed it, of course. Some asked, others simply looked. And though she never offered the full story, Madeleine would sometimes smile when someone lingered near it too long, sensing in them a quiet kinship. She didn't know if Jean would come back. And strangely, that no longer hurt, because something had shifted, not just in her, but around her. The letter, once a source of mourning, had become something else entirely, a reconciliation, a testimony, a peace. In time, children who had never known the war would sit at the same table where Jean had once traced invisible words into the wood. Lovers would lean close in the window's golden light. Life would continue, not untouched by sorrow, but deeper because of it, and Madeleine would be there, hands dusted in flour, heart open not with expectation but with quiet understanding. She had lived through the silence. Now she lived with the memory, not to mourn, but to honor, because the war had taken years, but it hadn't taken everything. We have new videos every day, real stories that touch and inspire. If this one moved you, share it with someone you love. And remember, the heart survives more than we imagine.